The Messerschmitt Bf-109E pilots who crossed the English Channel in the summer of 1940 weren't simply confident, they were certain. Their aircraft had torn through opposition in Spain, Poland, and France with a brutality that left little room for doubt. By May 1940, the Bf-109E had accumulated a combat record that read like a masterclass in aerial superiority. During the Battle of France, Luftwaffe pilots claimed over 1,800 Allied aircraft destroyed, with the 109 responsible for the overwhelming majority. When you've just dismantled the French Armée de l'Air in 6 weeks, skepticism about enemy capabilities becomes second nature. Werner Mulders, already an ace with 25 victories by June 1940, epitomized this attitude. He'd flown combat missions in Spain with the Condor Legion, where the 109's earlier variants had established German air dominance against Soviet-supplied opposition. The lessons learned there, the aircraft's excellent climb rate, its steady gun platform, and its ability to dictate engagement terms, had been refined into the E variant that now equipped frontline Jagdgeschwader units. Mulders and his fellow experten weren't bragging when they called the 109 the world's finest fighter. They were stating what they believed to be observable fact. The technical specifications appeared to support their conviction. The Bf-109E3, which formed the backbone of Luftwaffe fighter strength in mid-1940, could reach 354 miles per hour at 12,300 feet. Its Daimler-Benz DB601A engine produced 1,075 horsepower, driving it to 20,000 feet in just over 7 minutes. The fuel-injected engine meant German pilots could push the stick forward into negative G-dives without the engine cutting out, a crucial advantage they'd exploited repeatedly against French Morane Saulnier and Curtiss fighters, whose carburetor-fed engines would splutter and die in the same maneuver. British claims about the Spitfire struck Luftwaffe pilots as predictable propaganda. Intelligence briefings before the Battle of Britain mentioned the Supermarine fighter, certainly, but the assessments ranged from cautious to dismissive. Some reports acknowledged it might pose challenges, yet the prevailing wisdom held that British fighters were fundamentally defensive weapons. The Hurricane, which German pilots had encountered over France, reinforced this view, a solid enough aircraft, but clearly outmatched by the 109 in speed and climb rate. What particularly fed German confidence was the Luftwaffe's institutional experience. The corps of Jagdgeschwader 26, 51, and 52 contained men who'd been in action continuously since 1939. Some since 1937, they developed tactics, refined their shooting, and learned to trust their aircraft's capabilities through hundreds of combat engagements. When Oberleutnant Heinz Baer or Hauptmann Helmut Rick spoke about the 109's performance, they spoke from experience that British pilots simply didn't possess an equivalent measure. The mathematical logic seemed unassailable. Superior aircraft plus combat-proven pilots equaled inevitable victory. The Spitfire might look elegant in photographs, but elegance means nothing when a fuel-injected Daimler-Benz is pushing you through a vertical dive whilst your opponent's Merlin coughs and falls silent. That was the theory anyway. That was what made perfect sense, right up until the moment it didn't. The first cracks appeared on 10 July 1940, the date historians would later mark as the Battle of Britain's official opening. Spitfires from 74 Squadron scrambled from Manston, arrived at the intercept with enough altitude to dictate terms. The 109 pilots expected to see the British fighters below them, climbing desperately. They didn't. Flight Lieutenant Sailor Malin led his section into the German formation at co-altitude, and the Spitfires turned inside the Messerschmitt's defensive circle with a tightness that shouldn't have been possible. 2 109s went down in the first engagement. The pattern repeated with uncomfortable consistency. The combat reports from returning 109 pilots mentioned something they'd not needed to write before. Enemy aircraft demonstrated superior maneuverability at engagement altitude. What unsettled the Luftwaffe fighter arm wasn't losing individual aircraft, but rather the consistency of British performance. The Spitfire matched the 109 speed. It climbed almost as rapidly, and in turning combat above 20,000 feet, it possessed an advantage that German pilots couldn't explain away. Lieutenant Franz von Vera, who'd survived being shot down, described his 24th July engagement over Dover. The Spitfire turned inside my radius without difficulty, I was forced to disengage using speed rather than maneuverability. By month's end, Luftwaffe intelligence officers were filing reports that contradicted pre-battle assessments so thoroughly that some commanders questioned whether the data was accurate. It was. Bomber crews were reporting that when Spitfires appeared, their escort fighters often couldn't prevent interceptions. Adolf Gallen's post-combat assessments contained language that would have seemed defeatist a month earlier. The British fighter demonstrates excellent characteristics above 6,000 meters. Our advantages are insufficient to guarantee air superiority. The explanation for what German pilots were experiencing sat in two fundamentally different approaches to engine, supercharging and wing design. The Rolls-Royce Merlin III, which powered the Spitfire, used a single-stage, single-speed supercharger, optimized for performance between 16,000 and 19,000 feet. The Daimler-Benz DB601A's optimization curve peaked lower, around 12,000 to 15,000 feet. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin was still producing 87% of its rated power, whilst the DB601A had dropped to approximately 78%. That 9 percentage point difference translated directly into combat performance. The German engine reflected Luftwaffe doctrine that anticipated most combat occurring below 20,000 feet. The second part of the story was wing loading. The Spitfire's elliptical wing distributed lift across 242 square feet of surface, giving it a lower wing loading of approximately 25.6 pounds per square foot. The Bf-109E's smaller, more angular wing spanned just 174 square feet, and its wing loading reached 31.8 pounds per square foot. Lower wing loading meant the Spitfire could sustain tighter turns at altitude before reaching stall angle of attack. At 25,000 feet, a Spitfire turning at 240 mph could maintain roughly a 680-foot radius, whilst a 109 needed approximately 790 feet. That 110-foot difference meant German pilots watched Spitfires complete their turns and achieve firing position whilst the Messerschmitt was still coming around. August 1940 brought the fighting to altitudes where theory became brutal reality. Hauptmann Hannes Trautloft's combat report from 8th August documented what happened at 26,000 feet with clinical precision. Engaged enemy fighters at 8,000 meters, aircraft demonstrated turning performance superior to our own, unable to maintain pursuit curve, disengaged after losing altitude. Advantage, German. Pilots called this the Teufelskreis, the Devil's Circle, and by mid-August they'd learned not to enter it. When a Bf-109 pilot attempted to follow a Spitfire into a hard turn at 25,000 feet, he faced an impossible choice. Pull harder on the stick and bleed energy catastrophically, or preserve energy and watch the Spitfire achieve firing position. The mathematics of energy management meant the Spitfire could sustain higher G-forces at a given airspeed without stalling. Oberleutnant Julius Neumann of JG-27, an experienced pilot, described the frustration in his diary. The Spitfire pilot pulled his turn so tight I was certain he would stall. He did not. I tried to follow and nearly spun. British pilots learned to force engagements into this altitude band whenever possible. The standard defensive tactic became an immediate climbing turn toward 25,000 feet, dragging the fight into the Spitfire's advantage zone. The most damning assessments came not from British propaganda, but from the Luftwaffe's own Experten, Adolf Gallen's legendary September meeting. With Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, saw the commander demand what his pilots needed to win. Gallen, already a top ace, replied, "I should like an outfit of Spitfires for my squadron." Werner Mulders was more diplomatic, but equally clear. The Spitfire must be respected in all flight regimes, particularly above 6,000 meters, where it demonstrates qualities equal or superior to our own aircraft. The private conversations among Luftwaffe pilots contained even more candid assessments. By late August, experienced pilots were actively coaching newcomers. If you see Spitfires above 7,000 meters, do not attempt sustained turning engagement. By early September, both air forces were rewriting tactical doctrine. The Luftwaffe's shift was dramatic. Avoid prolonged turning engagements above 6,500 meters. Use altitude advantage to make slashing attacks, then extend away using superior diving speed. Don't try to outturn Spitfires at their optimal fighting. Altitude. This represented a complete reversal of their established tactics. Meanwhile, British squadrons were actively seeking combat at these high altitudes, turning into the attack when bounced, and forcing engagements into the Spitfire's advantage zone, an advantage that German bomber crews watched unfold with increasing alarm.